thank you very much. As Damon said, my name is Mislove. I'm at Northeastern University. I'd like to start by thanking all of the organizers for the invitation to come and speak here, Carmela, Rachel, and Damon. And just echo what Damon said. I like very interactive talks. I know keynotes aren't really supposed to be super interactive, but instead of talking at you for an hour, feel free to interrupt. And if you have longer questions, let's save it to the end. But if you have burning questions, feel free to just raise your hand. I'm more than happy to stop. So what I'm going to talk about today is some work that my group has been working on for about the past year and a half or so. And we started working on the area, looking at targeted advertising, and we started getting a couple of papers published. And then one day, I woke up and I had a pile of emails from reporters in my inbox asking about targeted advertising. And so you might be wondering, well, what happened? Like, my papers don't get that much press usually. And what happened was Cambridge Analytica. So about 4 months ago, most of you probably know this, Cambridge Analytica, the story came out that they had partnered with some researcher who had collected data from a Facebook app. They had data on 80 million users, and basically the entire press freaked out about this. And so I started talking to some of these reporters, and for those of you who've talked to reporters, you sort of want to understand what their angle is on the story before you figure out exactly what you want to say. And I found that basically the reporters I talked to had two different angles that I tended to see. The first was just freaking out about how did Facebook get all this data, right? And I'm sort of like, well, that's, that horse has left the barn, right? Like, that's their business model, which is like not super interesting. But, of course, I'm happy to talk to them. The second angle was, well, a little bit more subtle, like how did Cambridge Analytica in particular collect all of this data? And that's an interesting discussion because it involves Facebook app permissions and, and so forth. Many of the people in this room probably know sort of how they were able to do this, and we all know that my personality was certainly not the only app to collect this kind of data, right? But it didn't really touch on exactly what I thought was the most interesting aspect of the story, which is why did Cambridge Analytica collect all of this data? In particular, what did it allow them to do? Why were they trying to get profiles on so many users? And if you want to understand why Cambridge Analytica was trying to do this, you really, it's sort of hard to answer that question because the people who know are either Cambridge Analytica or Facebook, and I'll promise you neither one of them want to talk about this, right? So you have to look elsewhere. And one of the places you can look is, as a result of the Cambridge Analytica fallout, Mark Zuckerberg was hauled in front of the US Senate and had to testify. The US senators after that, they sent Facebook a long list of questions that about 3 weeks ago or so, Facebook responded to. And you can read through this, it's all public record. And there's about a 500-page document of Facebook responding to follow-up questions from the US senators, right? And if you dig through that document, you'll find the following statement. They said, Cambridge Analytica generally utilized custom audiences, some of which were created from contact lists and other identifiers, and in some instances, refined those audiences with additional targeting attributes. So my question to you is, how many of you know what that means? Great, like 4 of you. Okay, so what I decided to do in this talk was actually, before I get into my work, just give you some background, such that we all understand what this means, which will then help you understand what our work is all about. Okay, so bear with me for about 10 minutes, and this will mostly be background. So to explain all of this, we need to take a step back and talk about targeted advertising. So imagine you're an advertiser. One of the things you're most concerned about is who sees your ads, right? So ideally, everybody would see your ads, but unfortunately, you don't have that kind of money, right? So instead, you have some subset of users who you believe are receptive to your ad, right? They may be previous customers, they may be people like your previous customers, or whatever, right? So the way I've sort of pictorially represented this is all users are here, and the users you really want to hit are the ones in blue here, okay? Now, if we think before the internet, the best way you had to target were basically broadcast media. Things like newspapers, magazines, periodicals, this sort of thing. But that's an extremely coarse-grained way of targeting, right? So if you imagine it from this visual here, like you can sort of narrow it and kind of get your blue users, but you're going to get a ton of other people, right? And so what started happening when the internet came around is you could actually get more fine-grained targeting. So if you think of, like, say, Google Search is one of the first big advertising networks, you could now, because the mechanism or the medium is inherently personalized, you could start slicing and dicing your audience much more fine-grained than, say, a TV broadcast do, because it's a broadcast medium, right? So you start seeing search keywords getting you even closer to the audience, to sort of your ideal audience. And then, starting about 2008, 2009, Facebook advertising really came into sort of maturity, and this is what you think about, or you're probably thinking about when I say online social network-based advertising. Advertising based on user attributes. So let me take a minute explaining exactly what that is and what started when Facebook started doing this in about 2009. So the way to think about attributes is they're basically tags or features associated with user accounts. So those features can come from a number of different sources. They can be platform activity, so like in the context of Facebook, based on like what you self-report in your profile, or in Google, like what you search on or something like that. It can be based on third-party web browsing, so many of these services have trackers, as we heard about this morning, and they infer information from that. Or it could be inferred from partner companies. As you'll see later in the talk, a lot of these companies partner with other companies, they match their database, and then get additional attributes that way. So if you ever look at the advertiser interface for these services, it's actually quite powerful. You don't just have to target one attribute. You can actually create Boolean expressions over attributes. So I can target like men who live in Boston who like this band, but who don't match this other attribute or so forth. So you can actually create really complex expressions over these attributes. And this is present on most major advertising platforms, and I'll spend a minute going over those. I'll say that most of these platforms are opaque about where exactly the data comes from. They'll sort of say some very high-level things. And some of them do offer limited transparency features, but we've done studies showing they're quite limited. And so I'm happy to take any questions about that sort of at the end of the talk. But to give you an idea of what this looks like, if we look at Google, this is Google Displays Ads set of attributes. There's 4 different attributes you can target: age, gender, household income, and parental status. They divide it into very coarse-grained buckets, things like ages and so forth. In terms of where they infer this information from, for users who are signed into their Google account, they say this is based on settings or activity on Google properties, some partner sites, mobile device activity, so they're using Android to do this. They also infer attributes for non-Google users, and they say that's based on your activity on and off of Google. If we turn to Twitter, Twitter offers a few more. You have your gender, age, language, location, mobile device type, and now we start getting into like interests and behaviors and so forth. A lot of that is inferred from both profile data, things they call factors of account likeness, which is, I have no idea what that means, and other things such as user attributes, such as the accounts a user follows or that user's interests. So they're doing some sort of machine learning on the graph and based on what you reach. But now let's turn to Facebook. Facebook has over 1,100 well-defined attributes. I'll say exactly what I mean by that in a couple of slides, but these are ones that there's a very particular hierarchy of the attributes. These include all the basic things you've seen so far, as well as more sensitive attributes, things like relationship status, political leanings, income level, net worth, purchase behavior, and so forth. And again, like any other system, you can target Boolean expressions over these attributes. And they come from not only user profiles, activity on Facebook, as well as partnerships with third-party sites. Okay? Any questions about attributes? Most of you are probably somewhat familiar with this. Okay. So let's go back to my little graph here. Again, with attributes, that's getting you closer to the set of users, but it's still not quite exactly the set of users you wish to target as the advertiser, right? So what's the end game? What's the best thing you can do? Well, what if you, as the advertiser, could literally target exactly those users, the users who you know you want to target? And I'll argue you can actually do that today. So there's something called PII-based targeting. So the way this works is quite different than attributes. Literally, if you're the advertiser, you put together a list of your customers. And you take whatever PII, personally identifiable information, you have on them. So I'm talking email addresses, phone numbers, whatever else you got. Upload that to the service. And the service will actually match against their user database. Service comes back and tells you, okay, you uploaded 1,000 records, we found 500 of them, and now you can advertise to exactly those 500 users. And so if you're an advertiser, there's 2 reasons why this is very, very attractive. The obvious reason is it lets you get really close to exactly the set of users you want to target, right? In other words, you're not paying to show ads to people who you don't want to target. So it's a very efficient way to use your advertising budget. That's the obvious reason. The non-obvious reason is that this basically grows the advertising ecosystem. Because what it lets you do as an advertiser is ingest data from all of the sources of public data that are out there, and then integrate that into the advertising system. So what I mean by that is, like in the US, property records, criminal records, voter records are all public. In many states, they're free. And there's also a whole ecosystem of data brokers. They collect and buy and sell data on people. And so what this means is now you as an advertiser can figure out who you want to target off of Facebook and then go to Facebook or Google or whoever, upload their PII, and match against exactly those people. To show you how this works in practice, I'm going to walk through a few different examples. So we're going to look at things like the different features, how many PII fields you can match on, how big the audience has to be for you to advertise, and then I'll talk for a minute about hashing, because they're very concerned about hashing for reasons that'll become clear in a second. So the first of the services is called Google's Customer Match. So I have links down here at the bottom if you want to take a look at these. Basically what you do is you can upload 7 different PII fields, email, phone number, first name, and so forth. When you do that, you have to have a set of at least 1,000 to be able to use it. So if you upload less than 1,000 users, you can't use the resulting audience. You can't actually advertise. And they advertise, and they say that all of the data before it's uploaded to Google is hashed in order to keep your data secure. Okay? Let's move on. Next is Twitter's tailored audiences. So again, they have 4 PII fields that you can match on. This includes email address, mobile phone numbers, mobile advertising IDs. These are the things that your phone gives to the apps, and Twitter handles. And again, the minimum size there is 500 users to be able to target. And they say that the data is hashed so that Twitter never reveals or shares your information in your list with anyone or any other service. So they're quite concerned with privacy for the advertisers, not quite so concerned with privacy for the users. If we move on and look at Facebook's custom audiences that you'll hear a lot about later in this talk, they actually have 15 different PII fields, including things like name, date of birth, email address, phone number, and so forth. On Facebook, the minimum size is 20 users. So you can advertise to a group as small as 20 users. And again, it's hashed. It's hashed using no salt. It's just uploaded the data, again, ostensibly to protect advertiser privacy. What's interesting? Yeah?
Is the minimum size the size that must match?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Finally, there are other services that have this, including Pinterest. They have something called audience targeting. LinkedIn has something called account targeting with different number of fields and different minimum sizes. But they're all basically exactly the same service. They let you upload PII and then advertise to exactly those users. Okay. Other questions about this while we have you here? Nope. Okay. So let's go back to my sort of diagram here, right? So now we're at the point where we can literally target exactly the people we wish to target. But these platforms say, well, actually, we know much more about these users than, say, you as the advertiser does. So we could potentially offer you another service, which is we can say, okay, you're targeting this group, but we know other users who are kind of like that group, right? Potential future customers for you, right? So what if the platforms could then say, okay, well, we're going to expand your targeting group and recommend other people who are like this particular group. So this is called lookalike audiences. And again, the way this works is you upload your PII to the ad platform. It first matches the users and then finds other users who are not in your set who are like those users. And if you look at sort of the documentation that they say things like, we identify the common qualities of people in the audience, and we find people who are similar to or look like them. Again, this is common across multiple platforms. Facebook has something called lookalike audiences. Upload a source audience, and then you can choose the lookalike audience is between 1% and 10% of any country's population. Similarly, Google has similar audiences. They use machine learning to understand what they have in common. But notably, with Google, you can opt out of this in your advertising preferences. And finally, Pinterest has act-alike targeting, and you choose the percentage of the audience, the lookalikes, who are some fraction of the entire Pinterest user base. Okay? So let's go back to this quote. Cambridge Analytica generally utilize custom audiences and so forth. So what does this mean? Well, what it means is they were uploading PII, that's where custom audiences come up from, using contact lists and other identifiers. And then they were refining those using additional targeting attributes. Because remember, once you've created an audience, you can then go and slice and dice that audience in various ways. So if I upload PII, Facebook will come back and say, okay, now I've matched those users, and then I can say I only wish to advertise to the users with particular expressions over attributes. And that's basically what they say Cambridge Analytica was doing. Okay? So in this talk, what I want to do is take a step back and look at this entire ecosystem of targeted advertising. I want to try to understand what the risks are and whether there are actually any opportunities that they could help users to understand a bit more about this ecosystem. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus primarily on Facebook because, as you've seen, they're sort of the richest service, they have the most features and so forth. We haven't looked at the other systems, so I can't make any statements about whether they are vulnerable to the particular things we found. But the key questions we want to understand are there unique security or privacy vulnerabilities? How could these mechanisms be potentially misused? And are there any benefits that we can bring to end users? And if there's time at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about what I see as a broader research agenda looking at today's targeted advertising. Okay? So, before I go into the first section, any questions? Yeah?
Has GDPR changed anything in terms of users actually being able to get, for example, what is the list of lists that they're in or stuff like that?
That's a great question. I haven't looked at that. It would be very interesting to be able to ask, you can ask the services to give you this information. I haven't seen any changes to the transparency services that we've studied, but we're US based, so perhaps they do something different for Europeans.
Right.
So I think it's a great question, but it's something we haven't seen anything about. Any other questions? No? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is discrimination. So this is based on a paper that we published at Fat Star earlier in the year. You can find it on my website. And what we're going to look at is discrimination in advertising. And so if you follow the literature here, there's been a number of press reports about how advertising services could be abused by advertisers who wish to discriminate in various ways. And so in the US, there's actually very sort of a hodgepodge of rules that speak to discrimination in advertising. In particular, the rules are different for what kind of ad you're trying to place. So the three most relevant laws in the US are, first, the US Fair Housing Act, which says that it is unlawful to make, print, or publish any advertisement with respect to rental or sale of a dwelling that indicates any preference or discrimination because of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, or national origin. Okay? So basically it says you can't run an ad that indicates any of these preferences. The second is the US Age and Discrimination Employment Act, which, if you read this, basically says it's unlawful to run an ad expressing a preference for age when you're advertising for employment. And the third is the US Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which says that creditors who are advertising for credit opportunities can't express preferences along different protected classes. So these are the three areas we're going to focus most closely on. And one of the sort of the incidents that happened that brought this to the forefront was ProPublica was looking at Facebook's advertising system and noticed that among the 1,100 attributes that Facebook had, some of those had race in the name. They were called multi-ethnic affinity or something like that, where basically it was like they had different attributes like African American affinity, Asian American affinity, or so forth. It was sort of a proxy for race. And so what ProPublica asked was, well, could we run an ad advertising housing or targeting users who are looking for housing and then include or exclude people based on these ethnic affinity attributes? So they did it, and shockingly, Facebook let the ad run. And so what happened was ProPublica then reported this because they're a news organization, and Facebook came back and said, oh my gosh, we're so sorry, we'll never let this happen again. And what we're going to do, the way we're going to mitigate this, is we're going to ban those particular attributes for this particular class of ads. So to quote Facebook, they say ads promoting housing, employment, or credit opportunities can't be run using multicultural affinity targeting. So what that means is if you're using these attributes, you can't run housing, credit, or employment ads. So the question is, are we done? Does this fix the problem? Answer shockingly is no, it does not. So in this work, what we're going to do is look at all of the other targeting features that I talked about 5 minutes ago, and look at other ways that advertisers could implement discrimination if they wish to, based on these other features. And we're not going to talk really about who's liable, because that's really a question for the lawyers, and there's actually some debate about, is it the advertiser, is it Facebook, and so forth. But rather, we're just going to look at to what ability do advertisers have if they wish to run these sorts of discriminatory ads. But one of the key questions we have when sort of doing this sort of analysis is how do we measure discrimination? Right? What exactly do we mean by that? And so there are a number of different ways that you can measure discrimination and metrics you can use. There's one in particular we chose to use that's sort of intuitive and it's easy to understand, but again, there are others that you could use if you prefer. The measure we picked is called disparity. So let's imagine we have our set of users here. This is all users, say, on Facebook. And let's imagine that the attribute we care about is a binary attribute. So you either have it or you don't. So, so I'm coloring the users red and blue for this context. Now, when you're running ads, not all ads are relevant to all users. So one example of this is like if you're advertising men's clothes, then the people who are most receptive to that are probably going to be men. And so we wouldn't necessarily want to say if I'm running an ad targeting men for men's clothes, that's not really discriminatory, at least in sort of the way we normally think about it. And so the way you sort of address that is you have this notion of what we call a relevant audience, which is the idea is these are the users for whom the ad is relevant. And so in the case of, say, men's clothes, it would mostly be men. We'll say. And now we look at the targeted audience. I mean, who did the advertiser ultimately ask Facebook to show the ad to? Right? So the way you measure disparity is you simply say, okay, well, what fraction of the relevant audience was in the targeted audience? So we look at, say, the red users with the red attribute, and you see there's 6 of them in the relevant audience, 5 of them ended up in the targeted audience. Same thing for the blue users, 3 in the relevant audience, 1 in the target audience, and the disparity is simply the ratio between those two. So in this case, the disparity would be 2.5. And what this means is that if that disparity is far away from 1, that means you're biased either towards or away from the particular attribute. If you're close to 1, basically you're targeting users with or without the attribute at relatively the same rate. Make sense? Again, there are other metrics you can use. This is just the one we choose to use. And so now what we want to do is turn and ask, okay, of all the other targeting features, are there ways that we can implement discriminatory advertising? And so the most obvious way to do this is to say, okay, well, in the ProPublica study, they were asking Facebook to do the filtering. They were saying, hey, Facebook, start with all users and now filter them based on ethnic affinity. What if the advertiser instead did their own filtering and then went to Facebook and uploaded those users' PII who they ultimately wanted to target? Right? So we sort of played the role of an advertiser, and we went and we downloaded the North Carolina voter records. And what's interesting about North Carolina, it's one of the states that voter records are free or they cost some small amount of money, but they have gender and race and user's address in the voter records. So you can actually use this and then go to Facebook, and this is all public records. And so what we did is for every protected attribute, for gender, race, and so forth, pulled out 10,000 users out of the public voter records, uploaded those to Facebook using PII-based targeting, and then observed what fraction of those users did Facebook ultimately match. Right? We're sort of implementing discrimination, but we're doing it offline and then going to Facebook and asking them to just simply match this list of users that happens to be a highly discriminatory audience. And what we saw is you're able to match a very large fraction of the audiences, depending on your attribute. So for example, if we pick out the women in this in the voter records, we're able to match 70% of them. If we pick out African Americans, so the users labeled as black, it shows up as 63%, and older users, it shows up as 41% of them match. What this means is it's basically trivial for an advertiser who gets offline data to implement discrimination by simply uploading their PII to Facebook.
Yeah, did you at all control for whether or not the voter registration lists were themselves had discriminatory problems?
They may. We were just using them as ground truth, right, in this particular example.
But I mean, we're already perhaps starting from a non-representative.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, we could have gone to data brokers, we could have gone to other sources. We're just looking at how easy would it be for an advertiser who wished to do this offline to do this, and it's pretty easy. Okay. Yeah.
So this is probably a question for the lawyers and not you so much. But so in the text of the laws that you showed earlier, I don't have them exactly in front of me. Still, but I thought it said something like you can't post an ad expressing a preference for a particular protected class or whatever. So technically, is this violating that? Here the ad doesn't say, only
Yeah.
this class or not this class. It's just you're only showing the ad to
So
this class and not that class.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. It is absolutely a question for the lawyers, and I will say just I'm not making any statements about any company being liable. Please don't quote me. But I will say that there are cases we've just had some informal discussions, and one of the distinction appears to be who's doing the filtering and how actively involved is the platform in the filtering, right? So in other words, in cases where as you'll see later, there are cases where Facebook does a lot of the selection in this example, or this is a case where the advertiser's doing the selection, so that may impact who it is. But I will say, in terms of expressing preferences, there are the ad explanations. So if you ever right-click on a Facebook ad, it's got why am I seeing this? That will tell you the attributes that the advertiser is targeting. One of the attributes the advertiser is targeting. So you could, or it will tell you the ages. It always tells you the age. Right? And so there are indirect ways where there is information embedded in the ad about how the advertiser wished that ad to be run, if that makes sense. So, but ultimately it is absolutely a question for lawyers. Other questions? Oh, okay, so that's method number one, was simply using PII. The second is using attribute-based targeting. And the idea here is, Facebook banned 3 attributes. The ones that are, on their face are discriminatory, are basically representing protected classes, so race. But of these 1,100 attributes that we talked about a minute ago, and an additional 250,000 what we call free-form attributes, things like you're associated with a particular page or these sorts of things, could those be heavily correlated with the protected classes? And so to understand that, what we're going to use is the estimates provided by Facebook. So whenever you go to place an ad, the way it works is you specify using this interface exactly the parameters you want to target. So you specify the gender, the age, any attributes, and so forth. This is where you enter that Boolean expression. And then before you actually place the ad, Facebook will tell you right here how many users match your particular targeting parameters. And so what's nice about that is we can look at other attributes and see how close their intersection is to the attributes that we care about. So the way we did this is, again, we started with our ground truth, our North Carolina voter records, uploaded those, and then picked records of protected classes, like we did before. And then we saw, well, for every attribute, what fraction of the group we uploaded also had each one of these other attributes. And so from that, we can measure disparity. We can also measure prevalence in the underlying population. Just to give you a very quick snapshot of these results, what it shows is there are many attributes out there that are just as discriminatory as the attributes that Facebook banned. So in other words, in the US, looking at trying to select black users, if you want to include them, African American affinity has the highest disparity, but there are others like US politics very liberal and interest online games that have similar levels of disparity and similar levels of prevalence in the audience. If you wish to exclude those sorts of users, then there are other attributes that have very low prevalence of African American users. So for example, US politics very conservative, the disparity is 0.18, meaning you're getting many fewer users, black users, relative to the underlying population. Right? So the point is that there's many other attributes out there that you could use that are proxies for the banned attributes and are sort of facially neutral if you just simply look at them with respect to race. And again, when we're looking at this, we're only looking at single attributes. You can create Boolean combinations of these things, so potentially you could actually refine these in many ways to get much more accurate targeting. Okay? The third method we looked at was lookalike audiences. This is what I talked about a minute ago, where it grows your audience. And so again, what we did is we started with sets of 10,000 users, and then asked Facebook to simply find us more users like those, and then we measured the disparity of the larger set. And so the x-axis on this graph is how big we ask Facebook for the lookalike audience to be. So it's starting from the source up to 10% of the entire US population. And the y-axis is the disparity, meaning how biased was the resulting set. And so what you see is the lookalike audience feature works quite well. It finds users who look like the set we uploaded, right? So the disparity here, for example, for black users is up around 25. And this may sound, we're only looking at 2% of the population here, but that's 6 million users. And so our concern here is that this basically allows advertisers to amplify any sort of discrimination. If you can find a source audience that captures what you're trying to do, you can then ask these services to expand your source audience and have a larger set of users who share the attributes of this smaller set. Okay? So the summary of this part is, as we saw, all three targeting mechanisms can be abused. If you want to ask who's liable, please talk to the lawyers, not to me. But in terms of sort of how to address this, our feeling is that Facebook's approach thus far has been a process-based approach. So they looked at how did you choose this audience, and they're going to ban particular mechanisms for how you chose it, right? So you're banning particular processes. But we think that ultimately that's going to be sort of like a whack-a-mole game. There's always going to be other ways that you can get the same users. And so instead, what we're pushing for is an outcomes-based approach. Meaning you look at the ultimate set you targeted, regardless of how you got there, and then measure the disparity there and ask, is that allowed or is that not allowed? And this has some nice parallels with disparate impact in the United States, which is sort of a legal measure of whether discrimination is allowed in sort of hiring processes and so forth. And it's very similar in the sense that it says, I don't care what your process is, I'm ultimately just going to look at the outcome. And if your outcome is biased beyond an 80% threshold, you need to justify why that exists or it's illegal. Okay? So, before I go on, any questions here? Yeah, so I think that's a great question. Though, in case you didn't hear it, her question was about how should Facebook implement this, and should Facebook be responsible? Is sort of the essence of the question, right? Yeah, so I would argue, yes, Facebook is best positioned to be able to do this. And they're actually doing this already in other contexts. So with political ads, Facebook already is flagging them, and they have this special process for political ads now that I'm happy to talk about offline. But they are the ones who are seeing all the ads, and they're the ones who know these attributes. So they could actually do simple measures of, when I'm about to run the ad, is this biased in a particular way? And if so, maybe I go back to the advertiser, or I don't allow the ad, or whatever, right? So it's an interesting question, but it's one that I think the advertising platform is best positioned to enforce. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is a different kind of risk. And in particular, it's looking at privacy leaks. And so this is a paper that we published in Oakland this year. Again, link is on the bottom of the slide. I'm sorry if you can't see it. It's on my website if you want to read it. So to understand what we were looking at here, we need to go back to 2011. And so Alexandra Korolova in 2011 was looking at the Facebook advertising system. And the system back then was very different. It really was only attribute-based. It didn't have any of this PII stuff. But what she noticed was that suppose she could find a combination of attributes that uniquely identified you, right? So, some Boolean expression over these attributes. And if she could do that, what she could then do is infer all of the rest of your attributes. Because what she would do is she would run an ad with the set of attributes that uniquely identify you, and she'd add on one more attribute. And if that ad had an impression, what that told her is you matched, meaning you had that attribute. If the ad did not get an impression, it means you didn't have the attribute. Everyone follow? And so what she was able to do is actually enumerate all of the attributes using Facebook's thing. So she reported this to Facebook, and Facebook said, oh my gosh, we're so sorry, we'll never let this happen again. And what they did was they said, okay, whenever you run an ad, you have to have at least an audience of 20 users. So this is where the 20 came from. And so this still exists today, right? So if you're targeting a set of users, if you have less than 20 in this audience, then they won't let you run it. Even back then, she pointed out that fake accounts and whatnot sort of make this somewhat dubious, but basically this has existed until today. But as I said before, PII-based advertising was introduced in the interim. And so we want to understand, could PII-based advertising be leaking information in the same way that Korolova found that attribute-based targeting was leaking information? So let's take a look at this diagram that I have here. So essentially what's happening here is the advertiser is uploading data to the platform, and the platform is coming back and saying, here's a size estimate, here's how many I matched, right? So like you take a step back and sort of squint a little bit and turn your head, this kind of looks like a database query, right? You're uploading a bunch of data, you're getting back a statistic. So what we're worried about is, could these statistics be inadvertently leaking information? And this is especially worrisome because anybody can be an advertiser. You just go to ads.facebook.com and click I accept. And there's no cost to uploading this data. Like, you only pay when you actually run an ad, right? So getting these statistics are actually free. And so what we did is we spent about a few months really studying how Facebook's advertising system worked. How did they match PII? How did they give us these statistics and so forth? And what we found were there are two interesting properties of their system that both seem reasonable, but that together allowed us to conduct a number of attacks. So let me tell you what those two properties are. So the first is we looked at the size statistics that Facebook reported back. So we'd upload a list, Facebook would come back and say this many of them matched. So they never told us the exact number. And through a bunch of experiments, we figured out they were just doing simple rounding, right? And so they were rounding to basically 2 significant digits. So the number you get back was always from this set here. So 20, 30, 40, up to 100, 120, 130, 140, up to 1,000, and so forth. All right? So they were sort of obfuscating, probably to protect user privacy in this set. The second thing we found is a little more subtle. So let's suppose I uploaded a list of users, so email addresses or whatever. Internally, Facebook matches that to their accounts, and they come back and report the size of that. So in my simple example here, they report 3. Now, of course, they wouldn't actually report 3, but let's just, for the example, let's just go with it, okay? So the question is, well, what should Facebook do if I include an additional record that points to one of the users I've already matched, right? So in other words, I upload your email address, and separately, I upload your phone number. Well, Facebook was smart. They're like, I'm going to tell you the number of users in this set. So they say, okay, I'm going to deduplicate this set, and ultimately I'm going to report you back 3. Seems fairly reasonable. They don't want to lie to advertisers and tell them there's 4 users when they're actually 3. Okay? But it turns out that these two features together can be abused in a number of ways. So let me show you how we did that. But to do that, I need to sort of walk you through a couple of steps. So here's the particular attack I want to start with. So let's suppose I have a list of phone numbers, and I have your email address. I want to ask, is your phone number in this list? That's the attack. Okay? So is this victim's email address correspond to one of the users who have this phone? So let me show you how we can do that. So let's suppose I take this list of phone numbers, and I simply upload it to Facebook. Now Facebook is going to come back and report to me the number who matched, just using what we talked about before. So in this example, they come back and they report 670. So I don't know exactly how many. I don't know if I uploaded 1,000 records, which 670 matched. I don't know if it was actually 672 or 668 or whatever, right? But what I can do is I can add another record. I upload that list. Facebook comes back and says 670. I add another record. And then Facebook comes back and in this case says 680. So now what do I know? Well, I know that this one right here is what I call a threshold list. Meaning whatever internal logic they're using, that's right on the rounding threshold, right before the rounding threshold. Okay? So now what I do is I take that set and I add your email address to it. I upload that. What's going to happen? Well, Facebook's going to come back and either say 670 or 680. Well, what does it mean? Well, if they say 680, that means you pushed them over the rounding threshold, meaning you weren't in this list, right? But if they come back and they say 670, that means you were already in this list, meaning your phone number is in this set. Does everyone follow this attack? It's pretty straightforward. Okay. So it seems kind of cute. You're like, okay, that's great. That shouldn't be allowed. But let's get a little smarter. So let's suppose instead of asking, let's suppose I pick that target list very carefully. Suppose I ask, is your phone number in every phone number in the United States that starts with a 1? Right? If you are in that list, then your phone number starts with a 1. If you aren't, it doesn't. Repeat this for every digit, repeat this for every value, and in the end you can infer a user's entire phone numbers. Okay? It's a pretty straightforward extension of this. And so to validate that this actually worked, we attacked We looked at users in Boston, so we phone numbers of the form +1 617. There are 7 different values for the beyond the area code, and so each list would then contain 1 million numbers. There are 10 lists per digit, and so there's 7 digits. So in the end, we uploaded 70 lists to Facebook. Each one of them had one particular digit in common. We got 14 volunteers in Boston, and we used their email address, which they had already given to Facebook, to see if we could infer their phone number. For 11 of those 14, it worked. The phone number popped right out. For one of the 14, they had never reported a phone number to Facebook, so we weren't able to infer anything. For 2 of the 14, they actually reported multiple phone numbers to Facebook. And our initial methodology couldn't handle that. We have an extension that's in the appendix of the paper that does handle that. So ultimately, we were able to infer all of the users whose phone numbers they had reported to Facebook. We repeated the same thing in France using a couple of colleagues who were co-authors in the paper, and we were able to infer all 8 of their mobile phone numbers in France. You may be wondering about sort of what's the cost of this kind of attack. And I'll note the most expensive part by far is uploading these lists. But each one of those takes about 20 minutes to upload. It takes about a day to get ready. But that is a one-time cost. Once you've uploaded all these lists, you can use that to attack as many users as you want. And each attack takes about 20 minutes to get all the statistics and sort of do all the stuff that we talked about. So in terms of PII-based targeting, this is only one of the other attacks. There's also features based on website pixels, so pixel-based tracking. The way that works on Facebook is that actually creates an audience for you. And so we can use that to de-anonymize users who come to your website. We can get all of their phone numbers en masse. There's a few other attacks we have there. And in all of these, anybody can do this because anybody can be an advertiser. Any active Facebook user can be a victim, and there's no way they would know this had happened. There's actually no interaction with the victim, and it doesn't cost anything because all you're doing here is uploading data and getting back statistics. You're not actually running ads. So of course, we responsibly disclosed this to Facebook before we published the paper. They addressed it by simply removing statistics whenever you have PII, like a PII list that uses multiple attributes. So in other words, if I upload a PII list that only has email addresses, they'll report the statistics back. But if I have a list that has phone numbers and email addresses, they won't report anything, which does address the attack. But ultimately, it's sort of an unsatisfying solution. And so we looked a little bit about other ways that you could potentially address this. And if you recall, there are basically 2 features of the interface that Facebook had, the obfuscation and the deduplication. And if you keep trying to make the obfuscation fancier, meaning add noise or whatever, ultimately I can just take statistical samples and sort of get at the true value. So instead, what we propose is addressing the deduplication. So simply, if you're Facebook and when you go to match this set of addresses, you report the number of unique PII values that you match, not the number of unique users. Because then what that prevents me from doing is linking that this email address and this phone number actually belong to the same user. Okay? There. So let me pause there and ask if there are any questions. Yeah.
So the Korolova attack.
Wait.
Oh, okay. The microphone right next to me. Okay, the Korolova attack didn't use a report from Facebook on the number of users that match. It merely ran the ad and see if anyone clicked on it, and
or if there was an impression.
Or if there was an impression. Sorry, yes. Right. If there was an impression, it doesn't need a click. Wouldn't something like that? It would be noisier, but again, you can run statistics. Be a way to get around that last defense you made.
Absolutely. We were only looking at the statistic reported when you upload the audience. We did not look at impression statistics,
right.
And the number of clicks and all this other stuff. That's actually, I was going to talk about that a bit later, but I'll talk about it now because it's interesting. That's actually really hard to protect because those determine how much the advertiser is billed, right? And so then you're sort of getting this squishy area where do you want to overcharge, undercharge the advertiser, or so forth? It's not clear what the right thing to do there is. And so we haven't looked at that. I will also say there are other features of the platform that are also unexplored. They have this thing called audience insights, where you can go and see, all the demographics of your audience and so forth. There's a number of statistics in there we haven't looked at. And we also haven't looked at Google, Twitter, any of the other ones that also have similar features to see whether they're particularly vulnerable.
Great. Of course, that attack would then cost money.
Correct.
at
Yeah,
that
exactly.
point.
That's
So
why
that
we
is-
focus on this one where it's completely free.
Right.
to run.
Thank you.
Push on the bottom to turn on the bottom.
It also makes sense for Facebook to rate limit the number of queries you can make as an advertiser, and also maybe adding some more like barriers. For example, you have to spend a certain amount of money to make certain number of calls and so forth.
Yeah, so there are a number of things they could do there to raise the difficulty. Ultimately, none of those will prevent the attack, especially in the world of Sybil attacks, where I can create fake accounts or compromised accounts, and every single one of those can be used to create an advertiser account. So we're pushing towards this, like, more guarantees instead of so simply raising the barrier. But they, in our discussions with them, they are thinking along those lines of other ways they could just simply raise the difficulty of doing the attack. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is somewhat unexpectedly an opportunity. And so what I've sort of probably scared you a little bit in terms of sort of this ecosystem and all the things that exist, but I'm going to argue actually there may be some potential to help users using this system. So what I want to talk about here is data aggregators. So these are companies that are like Axiom, Datalogix, TransUnion, Experian, but their business model is buying and selling data on people. And so they collect data from public records, voter records, criminal records, as well as partnerships with other companies, aggregate the data, clean it, link it, and then we'll go and resell that data to third parties. Often to things like banks when they make a decision about whether or not you should get a loan, marketers, political parties, and so forth. Yeah?
Are these the same or different people than what are called data brokers?
Basically the same. I'm just using a broader term, data aggregators, because I actually argue Facebook is one of these, and you wouldn't.
Okay.
Data brokers are ones who sell the data. And data aggregators are ones who just simply collect lots of data.
Fair.
But yeah, exactly. So you're probably wondering, what kind of data do these companies have? And it's actually quite challenging to answer that, because generally, if you want to get data from them, it's probably under NDA or so forth. They don't really want you to know. But if you dig around on Google a little bit, you'll run across this slide, which I did not make. This came from Axiom, one of the largest companies here. It's sort of hard to read because it's kind of a terrible slide. But there's lots of scary things there, like individual wealth indicators, travel, dwelling, household information, and so forth. If you dig a bit further on Google, you'll find something like this called the Consumer Data Products Catalog. I don't think people are really supposed to have this, but somebody put it on Google, so go them. And if you look through this, all it is pages and pages of record types. So different kinds of information, different attributes, if you will, that you can buy on people. And there are literally like 50 pages of this. And there are things in there like the basic ones like demographics, home loan information, whether you're predisposed to gambling, whether you're divorced, if you're diabetic, a smoker, and they have these sort of categories like new teen driver and empty nester and so forth. So there's lots of very interesting stuff here. And so you're probably wondering, okay, well, especially for those of you who live in the United States, what data do they have about me? Well, they have a website called aboutthedata.com, run by Axiom, where they purport to reveal all of the information they have about you. And so I ran this for myself and my wife. And what you see is that when you go there, they have 6 different groups of kinds of data, so demographics, housing, vehicle, income, purchase data, and interests, where they have some small number of attributes in there, between like 1 and 30. And what I've shown here is the number of attributes they have for me and my wife, and whether or not those attributes are correct. And what you'll see is that, first off, this is much, much smaller than the set I've shown you like on the previous slide, where they have thousands of types of record types. And they're, the kind of coverage they have here is sort of odd. Like my wife and I own the same house, but all of that falls under me and nothing falls under her, for reasons that are entirely unclear. But anyway, the point is that the transparency mechanism they have is rather limited. Okay? The other thing they have that I thought was super interesting is I have like a number of blockers and whatever on my web browser. She does not. And so they have tons of information on her purchase data, but they have almost none on me, which I found was interesting. So use your ad blockers. That's the takeaway. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what rights do I have to this kind of data? And so in the US, outside of very particular areas like credit reports, you basically have no rights. You don't have the right to get your data. You can't go to Axiom and say, give me everything. Unlike Europe where you have GDPR. You can't check the correctness. You can't make them delete anything. You can't ask them where it came from. And you can't even know who has bought data on you. Right? You basically have no rights to this data. The Federal Trade Commission a couple of years ago released a report basically disclosing all of this and calling for a sort of centralized transparency website, so you can read the report online. But the point is that even today, there just isn't much transparency in this ecosystem. So the question is, can we somehow use the targeted advertising systems out there in some way to maybe reveal something? And so if we look at Facebook, one of the things we found was really interesting is Facebook partners with a number of these companies. And in particular, what that means is they're joining their database. So Facebook has its database, Axiom has its database, they've joined it, and they've imported attributes from Axiom and other companies into the Facebook advertising platform. To Facebook's credit, they reveal this on the advertising side. So if you go to place an ad on Facebook, you'll see some of the attributes here are tagged with a source. This says partner category based on information provided by Oracle Data Cloud, which used to be known as Datalogix. Okay? So it actually tells us something about where these attributes are coming from.
So Facebook has said recently that they're going to stop doing this. Have you seen any evidence of that?
They pushed back the deadline. So my understanding is you can't run any new ads with these starting sometime in early August. Originally that was supposed to be July. And then starting October 1st, I think they say they're going to be completely gone from the platform. So we'll see.
Do your research quick.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to study this, do it now. So what we did though is we crawled all of this and we looked at from 8 different countries.
Just one thing that should be emphasized is both in their public statements as well as Zuckerberg's testimony to Congress, they repeatedly say that all the data that Facebook collects has been given to them voluntarily by users, which we know is absolutely untrue. If you even just read Facebook's privacy policy, it discloses all of the data aggregators that they work with.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've done some studies looking at the transparency mechanism. So if you ever done the ad preferences thing in Facebook that'll show you your attributes, hilariously, they never reveal any of these. So there's, as I'll show you in a minute, there's a ton of attributes. They will never tell you which ones come from data brokers, even though they let advertisers target you with those attributes. So food for thought. So we crawled these from 8 different countries because the set of attributes that exist vary across country. Let me just finish this real quick. And so this table shows you the number of attributes from different sources, from different advertiser countries around the world. You'll see Facebook infers 614 in every country, and then the number varies where the total is shown here. And for example, in the US, that's where the number 1100 comes from. And then it goes down to, there's some countries where they have just a few.
Yeah, just a simple question for Axiom. So do you have to authentify when you use the service about... which was for Axiom, where you ask the data that they have?
Yes.
What do you have to authentify?
Oh, yeah. You
what
have
do you
to
have
give your social security number, which is awesome.
So you have to send your social security number in order to get. Okay. So if you know the social security number of people, you can get a lot of data just by using.
No. That's certainly you cannot do that. Or you're not supposed to be able to do that. I haven't looked at that. Yeah. They're supposed to ideally only reveal it to you. And I think you provide your social security number as well as other identifiers. Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying it's a good idea.
So you can do it for all your employees, basically.
What's that?
So you can do it for all your
Correct.
employees.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you the data. Oh no, it did tell you.
It tells you your attributes. So I don't think it reveals I'll have to look and see. It reveals like things like you purchased this kind of product, or you own a house worth between $500,000 and $1 million or whatever. So it's sort of coarse-grained attributes. It doesn't actually tell you very fine-grained things. Okay. So if we look at these attributes, if we dig a bit deeper to try to understand what's the difference between data broker attributes and the Facebook attributes, what we see is the Facebook ones are divided into 3 categories: behaviors, demographics, and interests. And most of these appear to be ones where you can imagine Facebook could infer them. Things like digital activities, so like where are you browsing online, life events, so like when you get married, most people post that to Facebook so they can figure that out. When you have a kid, you post that to Facebook, they can figure that out. Education levels entirely self-reported by users, and then interests come from sort of the pages you like. So these are ones that you can imagine Facebook would be able to infer. If you look at the data broker provided attributes, those are ones that you can imagine would be harder for Facebook to infer. So those include things like your purchase behavior, because remember they're partnering with Oracle Data Cloud. Oracle Data Cloud bought or used to be Datalogix. They were the company that runs loyalty cards. So when you go to the supermarket and scan your card, so they know exactly what you bought. Other things like residential profile, like what kind of house you own, financial information about your net worth and what you invest in, and all what kind of car you own and so forth. Okay, and so the question is, can we somehow increase the transparency using the targeted advertising system? And so what we're going to do in this idea is target users with attributes, but reveal to them what attributes they have in the ad itself. Right? Sort of use the advertising system against itself, in a sense. So in other words, we're running ads, targeting users who opt in, and we have an ad running for every single one of the 1,100 different attributes. And so if you're one of our users, you will actually get ads from us, but inside the ad, it will reveal what attribute you have. Now, we don't see that because we just simply see statistics on the number of impressions we get. We don't know who actually saw it. But what it's doing is it's revealing to users that if you receive this ad, you have this particular attribute. Right? So it's a form of transparency service. And so as an example, we ran this for me. I've sort of made this very small so you can't read it. These are my Facebook attributes. And then these are the ones that came in from Axiom, and these are the ones that came in from Datalogix. And they are more detailed than the ones that I got through the aboutthedata.com website. So we're still, we've gone through IRB for this and so forth. We're still at the point where we're testing it, but if you are interested in participating, email me and I'll let you know when it's sort of published.
Are your slides available?
Yeah. Not this one. Let me change that. Okay, so I want to finish by just talking briefly about what I see sort of the broader research agenda here, and then I'm happy to take questions, and then I'll let us all go to lunch. So basically I see sort of three high-level themes in terms of, if you're interested in this space, what I see as the open challenges. The first is auditing. So we've looked at one service, Facebook, and we've looked at just a couple of the features that they offer. There are many other services that offer similar features and different features. We haven't looked at those, so we obviously need ways to better understand these and scale up the kinds of studies that we're doing. And so there's other features like tracking pixels, mobile advertiser IDs, audience insights, billing information, and so forth that we haven't even taken a look at. The second is looking at sort of developing mechanisms to allow for privacy-preserving statistics. So some of our privacy-based work abused the way that they were reporting statistics to leak information. So you need some mechanism to release these statistics to advertisers, but that provably do not leak data. And this, so you sort of think differential privacy kind of sounds like the right solution here. It may be. I'm not enough of an expert to know. I will say there's lots of different mechanisms to release statistics, so it's challenging to implement, and also it's hard to limit the number of queries because advertiser accounts are basically free. So you can go create many accounts, and it's not clear what would happen if you expend the privacy budget. Then Facebook can't report any advertising statistics to anyone, which seems sort of bad. And finally, I think there's a lot of opportunities here to work with lawmakers and regulators. As technologists, we sort of understand these systems. Many of the lawmakers and regulators don't quite understand them. So I think working with the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S., similar organizations in Europe, there are a number of opportunities here. Especially remember that these services, there's no verification. Anybody can sign up as an account and use these services. So with that, I'm going to stop exactly at an hour. I'll say all of this work is in collaboration with my colleagues at Northeastern, MPI, USWS, CNRS, and Eurocom. And I'd like to thank our funders, the International Science Foundation, as well as the Data Transparency Lab, which is based here in Barcelona. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we have about 30 minutes for Q&A now. Lunch will be next at 1 o'clock. This room will be locked, by the way, during lunch. So anyone that wants to leave stuff, this room will be locked. So if you want your stuff during lunch, don't leave it in here, but don't worry about stuff wandering off. The next session will start at 2:30. If you want to leave during the Q&A, please leave quietly so that the rest of us can do it. And try and raise your hand and wait for a mic before asking questions.
So again, about the new rules with the data brokers, and it seems like there's nothing necessarily. Facebook's basically just cutting themselves out of the loop. A data broker can still sell custom audiences to an advertiser that can then use them on Facebook, right?
Yeah, so you can still use the PII-based targeting. So they're basically, what Facebook's doing today is they're simply matching the database and making those attributes available to all advertisers without having to go through the data broker. But as you point out, you can go to the data broker yourself, get this information, and then go upload email addresses, phone numbers, whatever you got, and still target exactly that set of users.
Hi, I have a somewhat adjacent question in terms of the research agenda. Could you talk about some of the logistical difficulties that come with doing platform research? For example, like you're paying the platform to study the platform to fix the platform's problem, sorts of things.
Yeah, so there's a number of interesting things. I mean, there's sort of technical challenges with doing this that are not super hard. You're sort of looking at the platform, looking at how your browser interacts with it and so forth, but that's fairly standard. Some of the more interesting challenges are, one, you're violating terms of service to do a lot of this work. I have some questions or some answers I will give you offline about my opinions on that. But that's just sort of like, that's table stakes in terms of doing this kind of research. The other challenges, yeah, I don't know. In terms of it's basically just measurement-based work. Like you're trying to reverse engineer the platform, and so yeah, I don't know. I can't think of any other challenges that are unique to this that wouldn't exist in studying other systems. Like we've done other studies looking at Amazon and Uber and so forth, and a lot of those challenges sort of come into play here as well. But in terms of you asked about paying the platform to study it.
Like if you actually have to serve ads, for example.
Okay. So there's a lot of human subjects protection stuff that absolutely you should go through. So when we were doing the studies, we only looked at our users who are on the papers, like the authors, or we made sure to never reveal any PII to Facebook that Facebook didn't already have. So we weren't sort of targeting users and giving Facebook their PII. So you need to be careful with that sort of thing when you run ads, and also interfering. Like when you're collecting ads, you need to be very careful not to cause ad fraud. In other words, so there's studies where people have looked at let me just go collect a bunch of Facebook ads, and they sort of hit Facebook a lot of times, and that's actually costing advertisers money. So you don't want to do that kind of thing. So we, in our studies, for example, when we're running ads, we're not costing any other advertiser money. We're actually paying them paying Facebook to show the ads. So those are sort of a number of the different considerations that come into play.
Thank you for your talk. My question was about the focus on concealing, finding out about discrimination by looking at the outcomes. I think there are some recent papers that show that you can actually practice disparate treatment and conceal it in the outcomes. So I'm thinking of Fairness Gerrymandering by Michael Kearns, but also the work on Sam Corbett-Davies and Sherrod Gould, where they have a really beautiful example of police stopping Black or African American drivers more often, and then by virtue of the distribution of the target variable being different, that you can conceal in the disparate outcome that this has been happening. So given these limitations, on the one hand, I wonder if there should be a stronger statement about discrimination and how these interfaces can be used. And could this also be suggestive of an arms race where those who want to practice disparate impact use these techniques to conceal the fact that they're doing this in outcomes?
That's interesting. I wasn't familiar with the work, but certainly, anytime if you could obscure it in that way, that whatever proposal we have would potentially fall under that. I will say that I think looking at outcomes is at least moving in the right direction versus looking at process. I think there have been similar studies on I'm familiar with one from the New York police where they were looking at the stop and frisk, and they had this very particular set of steps they walk through, and that was sort of if you start banning certain processes, there are other ways to get around it even more easily. So we think, looking at outcomes is probably a better way to do it, but there may be certain caveats like the ones you're talking about. So it'd be interesting to look at, but I'm not an expert. Yes.
Yeah, how are you exactly proposing to match the attribute and the ad? As you were saying, like when users will see the ad, they will know what attributes they have. But is it always a one-to-one mapping from an attribute and ad? And also, do you propose the users know all the list, which attribute corresponds to which ad, and then manage themselves all these things?
So that's a great question. Essentially what he's asking about is how do we reveal to users what particular attribute they have? And so what we're doing, remember, we're running, say, 500 or 1,000 different ads, and each one targets exactly one attribute. So what that means is if the advertising system works as it's advertised, and if you receive that ad, then you know you have that attribute. Or at least as far as Facebook is concerned, you have that attribute, right? So there are basically two ways that you can do that. The first way is you can literally put in the ad text or in the image the name of the attribute. So in other words, the user just sees the ad, they immediately know what attribute they have. Now, that may violate the advertising terms of some platforms. Some say you cannot do that because they're trying to prevent users from having, say, creepy ads that say no things about them. And so in that case, that doesn't really, it's not really applicable to what we're trying to do because these are all cases where the users have opted in to receive our ads and they want to know their attributes. And so if that's a problem, you could obfuscate the text in the ad and say, give an attribute number. You could obfuscate it using steganography or whatever you want, pick your favorite thing. But then give users a mechanism to decode whatever ad they see and figure out what attribute they actually have. So we're still playing around with exactly how to run that, but thus far we haven't run into any issues where the platform says you can't run this particular ad.
Thank you for that. So, advertisers can basically profile users and just target them. But what if contract Facebook or any other company that runs advertising? And so,
Sorry, it's cutting in and out.
okay. I don't know. That's okay. So what if the Facebook or other companies can profile the advertisers so that they cannot so many queries and the way you did?
So essentially you're talking about rate limiting or these sorts of things?
Or yeah, basically. So if Facebook just made a profile of your queries on the system, it would have been very easy to recognize that you're probably trying to extract information from your queries, right?
Yes and no. So I think the way we did it, absolutely. Uploading every phone number in the US that starts with a 1 is kind of sketchy, right? But if we were sort of ever so slightly smarter, we could encode this information using other encodings, upload it in more lists and so forth. So I think it would raise the bar, but I think ultimately, it's not going to provide you any guarantees, if that makes sense. So we could have, uploaded smaller lists or used multiple accounts or so forth. That would have, made it much harder for Facebook to try to figure out what exactly we were doing.
So in your de-anonymization attack, let's say Facebook prevents the application, it doesn't employ it. Can I still employ auxiliary information to attack the system? So I have, let's say, a customer database, but it's incomplete with missing information. I want to find out that missing information, exploiting this advertising system.
It depends. Again, we've only looked narrowly at the size statistics that are reported back from custom audiences. So when you upload, they come back and give a statistic. And our proposal would prevent that particular statistic from leaking whether or not two pieces of PII are actually linked together. That's sort of the narrow scope of what we're proposing. There may be many other ways that you could use external information in impression statistics or a Korolova style attack, or you could upload lists of phone numbers of users who don't exist, or users who are all asleep, and then if you get one impression, it came from your target user, not these other users. So I think there are a number of games you could play in that space if you wanted to try to leak additional information. We haven't looked at protecting those, and our particular proposal would not protect against those. Makes sense.
So several of the stories you told followed a pattern of the attack works perfectly fine, the attack is disclosed, a prevention mechanism is deployed. Did you find any cases where an attack against user privacy had been preemptively thought of and prevented by an ad platform at all? And what does that say about their incentives and behavior?
That's a good question. I would say, they do a number of things to ostensibly protect privacy. So, for example, the rounding of the number of users who are in the thing. I don't know if that's a result of an attack, but I think they probably did that to protect privacy. Some of the other platforms have higher thresholds, so like Google has at least 1,000 and so forth. It's not clear to me, how much that buys you, but it's a little bit more than Facebook. I will say that they were pretty responsive when we did responsibly disclose this. Eventually, once we got in front of the right people, so they have fixed that. I think ultimately a lot of this is a trade-off between advertiser utility and user privacy. That the more features the more privacy protecting features you give to the user, it's going to impact advertiser utility in some way. Like their statistics are going to be more off, or their billing's going to be more off, or so forth. And so Facebook, I think, is trying to decide where does it, how does it judge this trade-off? So I'll give you one example where we found an attack where we could infer whether or not a phone number or an email address corresponded to an active Facebook account. It wouldn't tell us who it was or anything else, but is this targetable, if that makes sense? And so we disclosed that as well, and Facebook came back and said that's not considered an attack. So in other words, they said that that's out of the scope in the sense, and they're okay with that existing. So that's a case where, to fix that attack, I think they felt it would have been too cumbersome, and they felt the privacy implications of that were not significant enough to warrant actually addressing it. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but they are concerned with this sort of thing, but I think ultimately from their view it's a trade-off between how much advertiser utility versus user privacy to play. If that makes sense.
I have a question here in the back. I wanted to actually follow up a bit on that trade-off. In a way, it's like I think calling these things advertisers or advertisements maybe is a little bit too narrow of a frame for something that is actually it's become the mode of effective communication in the current online communication ecosystem, and for NGOs, for political parties, for all sorts of types of communication. These are the most effective, have become the most effective means. So there's actually a lot of ways in which there's an incentive now even for entities that are not necessarily so happy with this type of data processing that is happening to be sucked into this and to use some of those ad targeting, communication targeting techniques. That presents actually a much bigger question about how to also do these trade-offs. And there's a bit of a danger, of course, that if the platforms become much more restrictive and they start to do all sorts of reviewing on the communications that they allow, or these sources, the types of entities that they allow to use these tools, that could be quite a big freedom of expression issue. Have you seen any responses by the ad platforms that suggest that there could be a kind of a narrowing of the possibility to communicate for entities that actually should be allowed to use these platforms also effectively?
So that's a very relevant question. I don't know if you saw the interview by Mark Zuckerberg the other day where he commented on who he feels should be able to use the platform. I think that's much broader than advertising, where we look simply at how are the advertising system protecting user data, and could they be revealing information. I will say that there is a new opportunity to look at who is running ads using the political advertising transparency mechanism. So Facebook has two mechanisms they've introduced recently that are quite interesting. Damon's been doing some work looking at that, where first of all, they reveal all ads that a given page is running, so you can see all of the ads they have running now. You can also reveal for political targeted ads, they have an archive where you can go and actually see impression statistics and targeting statistics, meaning how many men and how many women and what states and so forth they're targeting. So that's something where they're treating ads of one class differently than they're treating other ads. I'm not going to comment on whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly open for debate.
So they're more like comments than questions, although they may provoke. The first one is, this is following up on something that said. The U.S., we've always had an ex post facto way of handling privacy issues. What you're describing and it's talking about is really looking at outcomes. So you had a question much earlier, I think, from Ian about controlling the ads, but of course what you really want to look at is outcomes. And I think if you think about talking with FTC and so on, you really want to start using the verbiage of outcome, because I think that's, the ad is a mechanism, but the outcome is what's really important. The other is, when you made the comment just now about Facebook said, oh, it's not really a problem about phone number or email address, my immediate response was, well, my God, I'm not on Facebook. So that means that somebody else could find that out and therefore perhaps put up a Susan Landau. And so that brings up a very different issue, which is, I think it would be extremely useful for you to start talking to the national security folks, if you haven't been already.
We've just started that, but yeah, we're reaching out to folks, the FTC, and a few others as well.
No. I'm talking national security folks.
Maybe
so
you and I can connect.
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's talk later.
Be happy to.
Given that the discriminatory advertising is not going to go away anytime soon, and in this talk, it seems like you're focusing more on the advertisers and the platform, Facebook. I would love to hear your thoughts on what kind of strategies can users adopt to potentially avert discriminatory advertising. So let's say I'm assuming like someone is trying to do discriminatory advertising to me on the basis of, let's say, religion or sexual orientation or whatnot. So do you think there are some strategies that users can adopt to mitigate the effect of these?
So I would say, it's quite challenging as a user to see any, because the ads are ultimately personalized, right? So you're only going to see the ads. So there's basically two questions you could ask. One is, of the set of ads am I seeing, are those discriminatory targeting my attributes? Or for the set of ads I'm not seeing, could those be excluding me in some way? Right? And so both of those are very hard to answer unless you have an underlying distribution of all of the ads to see, what ads am I missing, or what ads do I get more commonly than other people. There's basically two ways I could see of addressing that. One is you can get a little bit of insight from the ad explanations. So again, you right click on the ad, why am I seeing this ad? It's very limited, they only give up to one attribute, even if the advertiser used multiple ones, and they tend to give only the most prevalent attribute, not the one that's the most niche. So it's not going to reveal a ton, but it will say things about age and gender and so forth. So perhaps you could get some insight from there. The other database you could look at is this political one I was talking about, because what's nice about that is they actually have impression statistics. So you can at least get an idea of what's the underlying ad distribution to do that, and then compare that. We do have a project in collaboration with the folks at MPI called Ad Analyst. You can Google it and you'll find it. And essentially what it does is it's a browser extension that collects all of the ads you see, all of their explanations, reports them in a anonymous way, and then we have aggregate statistics on all of the ads that users are seeing. So it's sort of like a crowdsourced ad analysis kind of thing. And so that may give you some information about what ads are other people seeing. And then you can look at, for the advertisers who targeted me, what are the other ads that other users saw from that same advertiser, to see if they saw different ads and maybe they were targeted differently. So ultimately, it's really an open question, but there's some steps you can take to get some idea of how your ads are different than other people's ads. Damon, I think is one over.
Thanks, Alan, for this talk and this work. And I think it's a great example of how sometimes some of your product features leak some information that you didn't intend to, right? And do you think there is like anything you can learn from this for the process of developing products and features that people could have thought of before? Or do you think the only way is kind of building what you want to build, like with utility in mind, and then afterwards do some kind of privacy risk analysis? Or do you think there's also something people can maybe learn from this for like, yeah, the process of building products and software?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know what happens inside these companies, so take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But from studying how these systems are developed and how they how they're implemented, it seems that each additional feature was implemented sort of in isolation, and they sort of look at, okay, how can I protect this feature? Well, I'll round it and do this, and then they'll sort of release that. But the leaks that we found were all sort of these, combining different features together, and each one reveals a certain information, and as a result, you can leak information. So I think, again, I'm not an expert here, but I think what you need is some sort of comprehensive way of, whenever I'm going to release statistics, I use some particular mechanism that provides me guarantees. So for example, some sort of differential privacy-based thing, or maybe something else, or whatever, whatever. I don't know exactly what the solution would look like. But I think that the risk is that different features could be combined together to leak information when each individual one is not leaking information. And that's exactly what we saw in our attacks.
For the political ad archive, I mean, maybe this is a question for Damon, but do you know if it's, do you know how broadly they're considering political ads? Is it, political action committees and so on, or is it just, parties and candidates?
So Damon will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the advertiser can opt in and say, my ad is political, and then it shows up in the archive, and they're doing some sort of machine learning, something looking at the content of the ad, and they will flag ads that were not self-flagged by the advertiser, and then put them into the archive as well.
Facebook has a definition of what a political ad or political content looks like. So they have, I think, 12 issues. They also do like political issues, so they've defined 12 political issues. I think one of the 12 is values. And so it's fairly broad in that sense of the word and things like that. And so our analysis of it, we've seen like people selling T-shirts, political T-shirts, we put into the political ad kind of thing. So it seems like they're taking the approach of perhaps more false positives.
And I will say this is one of the few times you get insight into the targeting specs and the advertising inventory, which is generally very, very hard to measure without conducting ad fraud, basically. So it's a very interesting data set. I think they just opened it up a month or two ago, something like that. Like it's.
Yeah, I think the end of May.
End of May. So it's fairly recent.
There should be some cool GDPR opportunities, though.
Well, keep in mind it's limited to the U.S., so there's very few European ads.